Hello, and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This week's episode is called How Automakers Make Money Even After the Car Leaves the Lot. I am Virup Narla, Senior Research Analyst in the Aftermarket team at S&P Global Mobility. With me today to discuss this topic are Todd Campau, Associate Director, Aftermarket Solutions, and Brian Rhodes, Research and Analysis Manager for the Connected Car and Vehicle Experience domain. Before we jump into today's discussion, Todd and Brian, I'm sure our audience would like to know a little bit more about yourselves and your roles at S&P Global Mobility.
Thanks, Farouk. As the Associate Director of Aftermarket Solutions, I'm responsible for reporting on the vehicle fleet really in the last 3 quarters of its life. So after it's left the OE dealership's lot as a new vehicle and been through the warranty period, maybe it's changed hands from the first owner to the second or even the third owner, and for the rest of the vehicle's life cycle beyond that point. So that's primarily what my responsibility is delivering insights and data around the vehicle fleet for the longevity of the life cycle of the vehicle.
Yep, and I look after the connected car and vehicle experience team. Our remit essentially is looking at hardware that equips a vehicle, from telematics, displays, speech systems, things along those lines, and then the services and, notably for the topic today, the monetization opportunity that we have after that vehicle is sold, that can be, services that can be added or taken away over time, and different things that we can sell by way of connected car data to the end user.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Todd and Brian, and looking forward to the discussion today. And with that, let's jump right into it. So in this week's podcast, we're going to be talking about the strategies that automakers around the world are utilizing to maximize their after-sales revenue potential once the vehicle rolls off the dealership lot. Let's start with the level setting of what generates after-sales revenue for automakers today. Now, beyond the need to support a vehicle for warranty or recall purposes, how important is a car to automakers once they sell it? Todd, I'd like to get your thoughts on this first.
I think the vehicle is increasingly important to a vehicle seller, a dealership, or a manufacturer of vehicles. We've seen much more interest start to grow in that space in things like all makes programs, because in the United States, for instance, the aftermarket is a neighborhood of a $300 billion a year industry, of which about maybe a third, probably a little bit less than 100 billion, comes through the after sales channel. And so we've seen increasing interest in not only things like oil changes and tires, but more involved repairs, like brake jobs and suspension jobs. We've seen the interest grow over the past several years in the dealership space for that after sales opportunity to support the new vehicle side of the house as well. As average age continues to increase, I expect that we're going to continue to see that interest in repairing those vehicles longer increase for a couple of reasons. First of all, the length of new ownership loans on vehicles has continued to get longer. So people are keeping those vehicles longer as a first owner. And so there's continued interest to maintain that engagement with that vehicle owner. But also because as average age continues to increase, the overall age of the fleet growing means that there's more vehicles out there that are older. And so there's a larger and larger opportunity to maintain those vehicles. And I think one of the reasons that there's interest here is really the maintenance and repair sector is almost recession proof. I mean, nothing is really recession proof in the end, but when we enter tougher economic times, new vehicle sales usually are the first thing to see a drag, while maintenance and repair of existing vehicle fleet continues to stay strong. It will see some reduction, certainly, as there's less expendable income, but people ultimately need to keep their vehicles rolling to go do their job, to continue to, to continue to make money and put food on the table, so to speak. So I think the original vehicle manufacturers and the dealerships are beginning to see that as a very good potential supporting revenue stream for their businesses. And I think to wrap up the question, I think that vehicle, after it rolls across the dealership sidewalk, is very important, not only to continue to develop additional opportunities for new vehicle sales, but also to just support a healthy bottom line.
Yeah, and to chime in here, coming at it from a connected services perspective, much more nascent, right? That doesn't have the history as Todd just expressed with the more traditional route. But we're seeing this become a significant opportunity, and already in some instances a significant contributor to the bottom line. There's example of an OEM that makes north of $2 billion today annually through their connected service platform. So when I say connected services, I'm talking about the kind of basic connectivity packages. So getting a connection through your vehicle, safety and security features, remote diagnostics, things like that. What makes this so important to talk about when you hear 2 billion compared to the size of this industry, maybe it doesn't get your attention, but the margins are extremely high relative to the rest of this industry. We're now talking more of a subscription business, broadly speaking. So leave the car. Let's talk about consumer electronics, closer to 35-40% margin, which is unheard of in traditional other avenues of selling a vehicle, or even selling parts. We have, especially over the last, let's say, 6 to 12 months, big claims by large OEMs in terms of what this will contribute to their financial bottom line going forward. I'll just rattle off a few from, I'll name 4 of them that'll total up about a third of global automakers. General Motors claimed that software, services, subscriptions, all of that kind of put together will at least equal the value that they generate from vehicle sales in 10 years. Volkswagen, for that same time frame, roughly around 2030, is targeting about 20% of their revenue to be subscriptions or mobility services. Renault basically put up the same number. Even Stellantis has put a target at 2030 of 20 billion euros coming from these services. So, today it's very piecemeal in terms of who's making money, but going forward, I think it's obvious that, especially when you're talking towards market analysts and investor relations type documents, and you want to put your best foot forward, it's clear that this is going to be a huge area of growth in the coming decade.
That's really interesting, and from what you both mentioned, it's really clear that after sales generates a significant amount of revenue for automakers, and definitely plays a key role in their overall strategy and financial performance of the company. And I'd like to follow up on that question with one that is specific to vehicle parts. Now, what innovative strategies are automakers using to increase parts sales, especially for out-of-warranty vehicles, because these are predominantly serviced at independent aftermarket service centers?
I think we're seeing a lot of things that have started to develop over the past couple of years. One of the things that we saw a huge increase in across the board with automakers as well as the independent aftermarket channel was more of a commitment to e-tailing, selling parts online. We've seen a vast improvement in the investment and in the quality of the experience of trying to purchase hard parts, to repair vehicles through both the automakers channel and through third-party marketplaces. In general, just making it easier to find parts, easier to identify parts. We've also seen a lot of interest on the automaker side in maintaining all makes of vehicles. In the past, there was a lot of focus on maintaining just their brand of vehicles. But as time has begin to pass, we've seen a lot more interest across many automakers in maintaining the broader vehicle fleet. So maintaining badges that are not their own. And in doing so, we've seen them add parts to their line in support of that and create, we've even seen brands created. I mean, there's some very recognizable automaker brands in the aftermarket channel. You know, AC Delco, for instance, for one, has been around for years. But we've seen other manufacturers begin to get into that space and sell their own after sales or aftermarket brand into the general population. The other thing we're seeing is there's a little bit more interest in maintaining those product lines for a longer period of time. Historically, you know, maybe 8 to 10 years was the target to maintain a portfolio of parts to support the vehicles that were in that age range. We've seen that continue to grow over time. And the other thing is, I think we're also starting to see some leveraging of their brands. You know, the OE quality part or the OE exact replacement part is something that is being leveraged. And so there's a lot of, it's really a multi-pronged strategy that it seems that is going on with the automakers. Again, as I mentioned before, I think they're also benchmarking the aftermarket in some of those things, especially the all makes. There's a lot that can be learned from the traditional aftermarket channel. And the vehicle manufacturers have taken note and have explored that and learned a lot from it. And I think also, you know, there is certainly some leveraging of the fact that they have a broad decentralized network with their dealerships. And so there's the ability to get the part to some degree forward deployed so that it can get to where the repair needs to be made more rapidly. So there's a lot of strategies that are being employed, I think, to move the hard parts. I mean, what Brian's talking about is, you know, connectivity and some of those things. We'll talk a little bit more about it probably in a little bit, but, you know, that's not as much as, you know, having a piston forward deployed to the location in the country where it needs to be installed. A lot of that can go over the internet when it comes to connective services, but that's not so in the hard part space. The part has to be near where the repair needs to take place, because most of the time, unless it's a, as we call them, a shade tree mechanic, that vehicle repair needs to happen in a timely fashion. And so people can't wait for 3 or 4 days for a part to get from one side of the country to the other.
No, I think with the strategies that you mentioned, Todd, you know, automakers should be able to draw, you know, more after sales revenue, at least, if not bring more of these vehicles back to the dealers for servicing. You know, thanks so much for your unique insights on this. And the third question that I have to the both of you is with regards to specifically connected car technology. Now, as it gets more popular amongst vehicles, what new revenue streams, you know, have automakers benefited from with these vehicles operating on the road? Brian, I'd like to hear your thoughts first on this.
Yeah, sure. No, it's a great question. I think, you know, the place to start here is on that popularity question, especially if we're looking through a U.S. perspective. We kind of give this assumption that all new vehicles are connected, and I guess in broadly speaking, that's true. That's certainly not the case globally. But you have to talk about the history of connections, right? How many vehicles are actually on the road that have an active connection? So, you know, there's a term we use very commonly, vehicles in operation, understanding the vehicle and what it's doing as it's operating on the roads. There's sort of an amendment to this. We talk about connected vehicles in operation, and there's two main differences here. Number one is the most obvious, right? You have to have the hardware that accepts the connection to a car. Right? That's pretty basic. Having a telematics unit that's running 3G, 4G, 5G, whatever it may be. The second piece is actually more critical, and that's how long is that connection going to be active for? You know, all of us have smartphones. We probably don't bring our smartphone to end of life, right? Maybe we keep it for a year, 2 years, or 3 years before we replace it. But there's a lifespan of that connection to where your provider is no longer gonna service your phone. They're no longer gonna keep it active anymore. It's the same for cars. That might be 6 years, 8 years, could be 10 years, but that lifespan really matters. So this is where we start to discuss the total addressable market. If we want to understand how big is this pie of revenue, we need to know how many cars are going to be connected and how long are those connections going to be active. So just to kind of paint a picture here, there's a real example, not going to mention the automaker, but one OEM has about 16 million vehicles today that are on the road with an active connection. And they have about a 20% subscription take rate for their connected service packages. By 2030, we're forecasting them to have 60 million vehicles on the road with an active connection. So even let's just imagine that take rate stays the same. They can never increase it going forward for whatever reason. That's about a 4-fold increase in their revenue opportunity over time, right? And this isn't a particularly unique example, right? That's pretty much where we're at as an industry. In terms of what's really going to drive growth beyond, of course, just a bigger market to play in, there's always a hot feature with connected services. There's always something that, and this changes maybe every year, maybe even less or more frequently than that. Again, we're more talking consumer electronics timelines here than automotive. A good example was Audi was the first to launch a navigation system with Google Maps, right? So you get this, sorry, not Google Maps, but Google satellite image. So you get this, that Google Earth type perspective right in your vehicle. And that was really hot for a while. They actually claim that increased sales of vehicles, or at least they claim that it increased the amount of people coming to dealerships to talk about those cars. And that goes away because now all the other luxury automakers have it, and we've sort of moved beyond that cool, kitschy feature, and we've moved on to the next one. I would say right now, phone as a key is huge. So, not needing your key fob, and more than that, not just getting into your car, but being able to monitor things like fuel, charge level, change HVAC settings, heat or cool your vehicle remotely. Personalization broadly speaking. So, just this kind of ties into that same topic where you sit in your vehicle and everything's sort of built around the way you want it. And maybe when your partner or your child sits in it, it can personalize to them as well. And virtual personal assistance is another one that's really hot. And when I say hot, I mean, it's driving package growth, right? Subscription package growth, or it's driving interest in potentially a brand if they're the first one that had Amazon Alexa or something along those lines. These are some of the features that really stand out. Another thing, just to kind of wrap that up, I think what I really want to emphasize here is the flexibility that you gain from an automaker perspective is key, because you don't have to define the vehicle at a certain point in its life cycle anymore, right? You'll of course have a set amount of features that you're going to launch with, but 6 months from now, after the vehicle's already been, marketed and everything, you can add a feature or remove one that's not working well, right? 2 years from now, you can add a virtual assistant that you didn't have at launch, and you can adjust prices over time. I don't want to say in real time, but pretty much. If you think this needs to be packaged with that, or maybe this was released a little bit too expensive and you want to lower that price, it just provides a lot of flexibility, and that in itself, I think, can generate revenue over time.
And just to take that a step further, I think one of the things that Brian touched on from increase in revenue standpoint, and how the popularity of connected cars could drive that opportunity. I think a lot of that question is how long that connection stays active. As Brian pointed out, obviously the growth in the number of vehicles that are connected on the front end can certainly increase, but when that connectivity is terminated, whether it's 8 years or 10 years, really is going to drive how much additional opportunity can be captured due to those connected features in the after sales space. If the connection turns off after 8 to 10 years, then it's going to be hard to continue to reach out to that vehicle owner and encourage them to come back to the dealership. So, in the current model, it may be time boxed to the length of the connection, but I do think there's some definitely some desire to drive people back to the dealership longer. The connectivity does span. One of the challenges for the vehicle manufacturers are that, once that vehicle is sold once or twice and it moves from the original owner to the second or the third owner, it gets more difficult without the connectivity to keep track of who owns that vehicle. If you have the connectivity, then you can serve that, that recommendation to come back to a dealership right through the vehicle. Whereas now, if you sell a vehicle a couple times and the manufacturer no longer is connected directly with that vehicle owner like they are with the new or certified pre-owned owner, it's a little more difficult to try to drive them back to the dealership. Connectivity solves some of that problem, but then you run up against the back end of the connectivity window. So it'll be interesting to see if the manufacturers begin to extend that connectivity window to try to gather more information and to try to gather more data to be able to commercialize the data. Because we haven't even talked necessarily about that aspect. I think the manufacturers have a lot of data that some, I think, may be commercializing it already, but there's probably going to be additional opportunity to anonymize and commercialize data about the vehicles and where they're being used and things like that. So those could be a couple revenue streams that could develop, but a lot of it will depend on the cost versus benefit connection to keeping those vehicles connected for a longer period of time.
To what you both had mentioned, I've been really excited to get 5G on my phone because just of the increased bandwidth and speed. But I think it'll be really exciting to see it in action, specifically in the automotive industry, because as more of these vehicles on the road, get connected car technology, there's going to be a whole new dimension to after sales revenue with new innovative solutions, as you mentioned, Brian, and this whole increased convenience perspective to the customer, as you mentioned about parts and servicing and so on to the customer, as you mentioned, Todd. And with that, I just like to shift the focus to what automakers are looking at currently to what they're expected to do in the future, especially as electric vehicles, they're going to grow really quickly amongst the vehicles in operation. Now, considering warranty periods would be longer for electric vehicles than internal combustion engine vehicles, and thereby expecting a considerable revenue decrease, especially for regular maintenance, how are automakers expected to generate more after sales revenue moving forward? Todd, let's get your thoughts first.
I think that's a very interesting question. Partially because, as you said, the warranty period right now for battery electric vehicles, I believe, is legislated at 8 years, 100,000 miles or something along that lines.
Right.
And if you balance that about what we were just talking about, where the connectivity is maybe only 10 years, it really begins to bring into question what you just asked. Like, how do they manage to gain more revenue and increase after sales if the opportunities go down with electric vehicles and we're warranting them for a longer period? So I think they're going to have to get very creative and be very aggressive with retaining customers for as long as they can. One thing that is interesting right now to me is the complexity to maintain and calibrate ADAS features, and I'm sure electric vehicle features as well. So there may be an opportunity for the after sales to capture more because of the expertise required to keep these even more modern vehicles on the road than what we're seeing today, the electric vehicles. So that may be an opportunity that naturally falls into their lap. But I think it will be interesting to see the methodologies that they take going forward. I do think that the potential of extending the all makes maintenance capability might be something that would make sense, because there's not a lot of standardization in the way that ADAS is calibrated today. And in what we've reviewed from maintenance of electric vehicles, there's also a lot of variance in the way the electric vehicles are maintained. So seeing some of that begin to coalesce around a more of a standard approach. If you ask somebody about an oil change, people have different opinions, but in general, people will say an oil change is every, you know, 3,000, 5,000, 7,500 miles, depending on their age more than anything at this point. But if you ask somebody, when should your battery electric vehicle be maintained? When should you change your cooling fluids? Right now, it's all over the board if you look at what the vehicle manufacturers are saying. So maybe if they standardize that a bit and also do an all makes program, there'd be an opportunity to expand revenue that way. But I think it'll be very interesting to watch how this develops, because there's definitely going to be some growing pains, I think.
Yeah, and maybe just broadening out in general on electric vehicles. This is a really big deal for the connected car. Not so much with just pure connectivity, but for over-the-air updates. So the ability to keep this vehicle updated over time, add and remove content over time. EVs are a game changer. The biggest aspect of this is that you need to have some kind of access to the vehicle running, right? At least the battery of an ICE vehicle, a traditional combustion engine vehicle, operating so that you can receive these updates, so that you can download something, install something, etc. On an electric vehicle, it can be nascent, right? It can just be parked in your garage or plugged in at work. It's not really a big deal in terms of even how large these things are, or how large the updates are, or how frequently they come, as long as there's some management of or over the kind of user experience side of informing the owner of what's happening, right? But that could happen over your phone. It can happen it doesn't necessarily have to happen in the vehicle, right? Or in the vehicle, maybe you can schedule it for later. Some are doing that. With a traditional combustion engine, you need to be present for that in most cases. Your vehicle at least needs to be idling, and that's tough, right? Nobody wants to get in their car to start their day and wait 20 minutes to download anything, right? Or even when they come home from work, the first thing you want to do is go inside. You don't want to sit in your car for any longer than you have to do, in most cases. And a lot of these things, depending on the functionality, you can't update while you're driving. Again, that's pretty dependent on what's being updated. So this is a significant deal. We talked to a lot of automakers that really struggle with how to manage OTA updates on a traditional combustion vehicle, and that problem just pretty much doesn't exist on an electric vehicle. So you have to do a lot of homework in terms of how big are you going to make the update? Do you want a bunch of tiny ones so that you can't really feel it so much as a user, or one big one so we don't annoy a user? You can understand how much of a headache that is. So yeah, again, I think this, if we talk about all this opportunity, we also should talk about the risk if we are in a traditional combustion engine environment, and that we can't do too much via OTA. But on the other side, if the market does move in the direction that we think it might in terms of electrification, that opens up all these opportunities I've outlined.
That's actually a perfect segue to my next question. Thanks so much, Brian. Given that these vehicles are expected to be much more connected, as you said, compared to internal combustion engine ones, automakers are definitely going to be able to get much deeper access and much broader access as well into a vehicle's behavior, both in terms of maintenance and with the additional features that are being installed over the air or even at the dealership. What are your additional thoughts on this, if I can just get them from you?
Yeah, definitely. And maybe just to clarify one point, there's still a lot of opportunities for the connected car on a combustion engine. It's really just this topic of over-the-air updates and these heavy updates that favor EVs. Right, exactly. But in terms of the vehicle behavior, I think one aspect that's really fascinating to talk about is the buying experience of a vehicle. And it's not about vehicle to vehicle, but once you've selected the car you want, there's, in my opinion, a huge inefficiency in our industry in terms of how we handle the packaging of content and trims, right? Of the dealership needing to keep a certain amount of volume available, of course, the automaker and the supply chain needing to plan for that different volume. And then in some cases, you're the consumer and you're there and you don't want to wait another, however long it might take for you to get the very specific trim. So you might just accept the closest one you can find, right? Whether that's a higher or a lower price, less content or more content that you wanted. I just find it incredibly inefficient. So, one thing that really fascinates me about paid updates, which is sort of the next generation of this connected service story, is you can do a lot with software. We can define horsepower with software. We can limit range with software. You can have heated seats installed, but don't turn them on unless, you give the say so. Along with all the features, of course, that you might traditionally consider in a connected service package. I think some of the initial reaction to this, especially when Tesla does it, can be like, oh, that's cheap. Why would you limit something like that? But it's just about handling the variety that the consumer wants to see in a vehicle lineup without the complexity of handling the variety that the supply chain and the automaker have to deal with, right? I find that to be a huge opportunity. So when we talk about consumer behavior and buying patterns, I think that's a bit of a game changer, right? To really control how that vehicle's spec'd. And then when we start talking about used vehicles, maybe, just theorizing here, if it's sold back to the dealership, they could respec that any way they wanted and reset it for the next buyer if they wanted to. Talking about getting into more behavioral patterns over time, there is a handshake agreement we have made with the technology industry to exchange our data for some value add to our lives. This is not something the automotive industry is trying to prove. I think this has already been proven. And of course, that's a little different in every country. But if you use Google Maps, that might be baked into the cost of the phone. It could be baked into the cost of the phone plan in a very abstract way. But in reality, you're using a free service in exchange for allowing Google to accept or to collect a whole lot of data about yourself. And that's one example of a million examples we give. Even some paid services, of course, like Netflix is collecting a ton of data about your viewing habits. That for sure exists in the car, and it's only going to increase, right? So this might look like a free package, a free connected service package that gives you, let's say, a virtual personal assistant. But in exchange, you have to press accept to whatever litany of content they want to collect. And that often can be perceived in a negative way. But of course, this is really important for improving those features, maybe coming out with new features later on. There's a large amount of value add things that can be done with that data. Of course, it also allows them to anonymize that data and sell that data if they want to, right? Maybe in exchange to a map supplier for cheaper rates on a licensing agreement, or maybe just a raw data cell to somebody that's going to use it for advertising or for infrastructure planning or anything like that. This kind of story is not new, but I think we're really starting to understand how much value it might bring to automotive.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't know that I have a lot to add to that. Brian did a really good and thorough job there, but I do think when it comes to subsequent owners, I think that's a very interesting proposition as they continue down this path of really adding more connected technology, adding more software to the car. As that vehicle ages and the owners change, there may be a appetite to be able to customize that vehicle that might not have had the heated seats might be a great option. Maybe the original owner never wanted heated seats, but the second or third owner does. And if that could just be turned on by a subscription or a one-time buy on a 7-year-old vehicle that you're buying used, that I think that kind of flexibility and customization is something that quite frankly, the specialty equipment manufacturers have been assisting vehicle owners in doing for years. So, if as the software and connected vehicle begins to permeate the fleet, there may be more opportunities for the vehicle manufacturer to capture some of those opportunities through offering customization packages to, obviously within the capability of the vehicle, but to offer those customizations as OTA updates that any vehicle owner could subscribe to or purchase at any point in that vehicle's life cycle. I think that could be interesting, because we all know that personalizing a vehicle is something that many people enjoy doing, and this would provide another method for doing that. So I think it's very interesting as we begin to see the connected vehicle permeate the fleet, to see how this evolves.
I think from what the both of you have mentioned today, it definitely looks like it's going to be a truly exciting journey ahead to see, how the different aftermarket strategies would maximize revenues for each of the automakers, when the vehicles leave the dealership lots. And I think it's going to be really eye-opening to see how the strategies also evolve in the coming years as more of electric vehicles especially come on the road. So thank you so much, both of you, for the conversation today and your detailed and in-depth insights. But just before we wrap up today's episode, very quickly, it would be interesting to know what each of you think, on a very quick question. What would be the most important after-sales strategy in the future, according to you?
Thanks, Farouk. And to start with, I'll take this question from primarily the parts perspective, and I'll let Brian, who is obviously far more capable to answer the over-air connected car questions. I'll let him handle most of that. But I think, we've touched on it through the episode, but it's an interesting point in time where, as we evolve to electric vehicles and warranties elongate, and connectivity potentially ends at a certain point in time, you're going to see a challenging situation for the after sales at the dealership to manage those changes, for sure, to understand how they can increase their parts sales and their after sales repair opportunities in a situation where the warranty period extension is really taking a lot of where they would have made their revenue historically and putting it back under warranty. So it'll be interesting to see the methodologies that are employed, the skill sets that are developed, especially I think around maintenance and calibration of ADAS technologies and expertise around electric vehicle maintenance, as well as maybe leveraging connectivity to find ways to continue to maintain or possibly gain their share of that aftermarket maintenance in a world where much of the time that they've captivated to date is now going to come under the warranty period. So that's what's going to be interesting to me as we shift to electric vehicles, to see the strategies that are employed to continue to grow and maintain the after sales channel, whether it be through over-the-air updates or connected cars or just general maintenance strategies that increase the number of years that they maintain. But I think it's going to have to be some combination of those levers being pulled to continue to grow their opportunity in the parts domain.
Yeah, from a tech perspective, I mean, I mentioned this, the electric world removes so many barriers here, that I think really the focus becomes how much is the automaker going to wrap their hands around this and embrace it. Two words you don't typically associate with the industry. Maybe I'm being overly harsh. Creativity and flexibility. Those are the two biggest things that this gives you. An OTA platform, a connected vehicle, and an electric vehicle. If you can combine all three of those together, you have so much flexibility for how you can content a car. And not only contenting, but there's also story on packaging and pricing. Packaging decisions of services are done in a pretty similar way that you would go through the product planning process for packaging, leather seats in a sunroof, right? There's a lot of thought and care provided to that conversation. Obviously, it's a big deal. But your ability to test this with your users, right? Your customers that are driving these vehicles, and adjust things on the fly if maybe it's not working, it's there. Tesla's a great example here, right? They have had these one-time fee paid updates for heated seats, for their autopilot platform, and then a couple tweets down the road, they have a subscription variant of that you can turn on and off. And it might seem like a minor thing, but if you imagine that at scale, at a very large automaker, that's really powerful. And to be able to hear your customers and react without having to wait however many years to sell them a new vehicle, that's a game changer. Another thing here is I think there's a conversation on brand loyalty here. So if we go back to the strategy of being willing to maybe take some risks, General Motors, great example. I think it was early 2021, they added Alexa to their vehicles, but this went back to vehicles as far as 2019. So, you might have a 2-year-old GMC Sierra, and all of a sudden one day you have a pop-up in the head unit asking if you want Alexa. That's pretty cool, right? There's really no downside outside of accepting it and then maybe the feature not working too well. But you're giving the option, you can opt out if you don't want to use it, but that's a powerful touch point to your customer. So I think embracing just how flexible you can be and being willing to be a little creative in packaging and pricing and new content over time. And eventually I think we'll get to the point where pre-launch of a vehicle, we're actually pre-planning what it might look like in a year and 2 years and 3 years for new content, without getting maybe too bogged down in details because preferences are going to change over time, of course. But yeah, I think that's really going to be a powerful strategy going forward with those that are willing to embrace it.
Fantastic. That was great. Thank you both for your views on the current strategies and your future expectations. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. A big thank you to you both for joining this Autology podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks, Farouk. And
thank you to all your listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@ihsmarket.com email. You can also find out much more at Autotech Insight and Aftermarket Insight with the links in the description below. Don't forget to hit all the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts. We look forward to joining us again in the next episode. Goodbye for now.